Hello everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. I'm Dr. Kranti Vora, an additional professor at Indian Institute of Public Health, Gandhinagar, and welcome all to this webinar, which is the first one in a webinar series which we are going to have. The next one is on 12th and then again on 14th. Look at our Facebook page for the further announcements. Indian Institute of Public Health Gandhinagar is the first public health university of India, and we run master's course and postgraduate diploma courses. We run 2-year master's course in public health, masters of public health and masters in hospital administration, and those courses are open to any graduate. And currently we are uh, uh, inviting applications for the same. Many of you have already applied, and we're looking forward to welcoming you for the process of application. We are joined by the director, Dr. Dilip Maulankar. I would like sir to say something and maybe initiate the webinar. Thank you, sir.
Can you hear me all? Thank you very much for
Yes, we
joining
can.
this webinar. We thought that there has been so much of discussion on the COVID disease, its spread, many aspects, epidemiology, flattening the curve, what treatment methodologies can be used, etc. So we thought that we will talk to you and get our local experts to talk about the basics of the virus, the nature of the virus, because it's a new virus, what kind of immunological processes are there, and finally what type of testing, so that we understand, because there is also a lot of debate saying should this test be done, that test be done, whether we should do serological or RT-PCR, etc., etc., how many numbers of tests. So before all that discussion, we must understand the basics of that. And that is why we thought and requested our team, Dr. Senthil, Dr. Aarti, and we were very happy that Dr. Sandeep Shah, who is a luminary in the testing field, pathologist, is also joining us. So with that, let me welcome you all, and we hope we will continue to discuss this new disease in a series of such webinars. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, sir. So our speakers are Dr. Senthil Kumar Natesan, who is a virologist who has been trained in world-renowned institutes of IVRI and Johns Hopkins Medical School. We have Dr. Aarti Sundararajan, who also has been trained in US in University of Tennessee and worked in Emory University. We are joined by Dr. Sandeep Shah, who's Chief Executive Officer and Laboratory Director of one of the largest laboratory group in Gujarat and Western India. So they are going to talk about the evolution of virus, immunological response, and testing. So I invite Dr. Senthil Kumar Natesan to start his presentation. Just one note that we'll take questions at the end of all the three presentations. So please post your questions in the chat box and we'll take them at the end of all three presentations. Thank you. Dr. Senthil Kumar Natesan.
Thank you, Dr. Kranti. Thank you, Professor Maulankar. So good morning to everyone and welcome to our webinar today. I'm going to talk about the origin and evolution of SARS coronavirus 2, which is causing COVID-19, which is pandemic affecting more than 200 countries worldwide. As you may know that this is a new virus. This virus epidemic started in December 2019. So it is a just 5-month-old virus. We are still learning more about this virus. So I will update you what we know about this virus so far in terms of its origin and evolution. So the coronavirus is not new to human beings. In fact, the first coronavirus was isolated in a human in 1965. Subsequently, there were 3 more coronaviruses were also recognized. And these 3 viruses are always endemic in human population. They cause common cold and mild respiratory infections throughout the year, but their infections are peak during the winter and cold seasons. And these viruses, in the recent past, there were 2 emerging coronaviruses, SARS coronavirus 1 in 2002 and MERS coronavirus in 2012, that caused very severe respiratory infections. And of course, currently the SARS coronavirus 2, which is a new member of this family, causing the pandemic COVID-19. So this virus is an enveloped RNA virus. It has, if you look at the structure, it has a lipid membrane, which is called envelope, decorated with several proteins on the membrane, such as spike protein, envelope protein, membrane protein. Inside the envelope, it has this genome, which is a single-stranded RNA, and the genome is encapsulated with the N protein. Together, it is called a nucleocapsid. But the envelope is a lipid and it is delicate. Because of it, this virus is very less stable and get inactivated easily by any common disinfectant. The size of the virus is around 100 nanometer. So we cannot see this virus in normal microscope. You need an electron microscope to visualize it. So when you look at it under the electron microscope, you can have an virus looking like this as shown in the image. As you see closely, it has crown-like spikes on the outer edge of the virus, which gives their name coronavirus. So the spikes, what you see is actually the spike protein. This protein is very important for the virus because this mediates the virus entry into the host cell. And it binds to the, it's on the virus surface, it binds to a specific receptor called ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor on the cell surface, and binding this allow the virus to enter the host cell. So this receptor expresses in lung cells, heart cells, kidney cells, and also intestine. So wherever the cells has this receptor, potentially target for the virus to enter and replicate. So this SARS coronavirus spike is also found to be like 10 to 20 times more efficient to bind this particular receptor than its close relative SARS coronavirus 1. So this may enable the SARS coronavirus 2 to replicate efficiently and spread more easily from person to person. So if you look at the genome of the virus, it's a single-stranded RNA genome. Its length is about 30,000 base pairs. If you compare this with the human genome, which is a double-stranded DNA genome, and the length is about 3 billion base pairs. So this viral genome is around 1 lakh times smaller than the human genome, but still it can kill the human beings. So if you look at the viral genome more closely, the 2/3 of the left codes for proteins that is required for virus replication. Only the right 1/3 of the genome codes for proteins required for making the structure of the virus. So during the initial outbreak of this virus in Wuhan, the whole genome was first sequenced immediately. And this helped us to develop the RT-PCR assay for the diagnosis of COVID-19. So most of the coronavirus have origins in the variety of bat species. To date, we know there are over 200 coronaviruses have been identified in bats. Approximately 35% of all the viruses in bats are coronaviruses. So during the evolution, some of bats learned to coexist with many coronaviruses without any sign of disease. So they have adapted several mechanisms to coexist along with these viruses. So one of the mechanisms is a weakened virus sensing system. If you look at the virus sensing system, the interferon activation pathway is the key pathway. When the virus enters, this is the interferons, they get activated to mount an immune response against the virus. If you look at this pathway, a lot of genes involved in that pathway is lost in the bat. So they can't efficiently mount an virus sensing or antiviral immune response. So another adaptation is they can't mount an inflammatory response against these viruses very efficiently. So some of these bats are able to mount a balanced inflammatory response that is not self-destructive, and at the same time, it allows it doesn't allow the virus to kill all the cells. So it has adapted these mechanisms to coexist with the virus. If you look at in the human, the response against the virus, the inflammatory response against the virus itself is very destructive. In the process of eliminating the virus infected cells, it kills a lot of normal healthy cells and like a collateral damage. So before talking about the SARS coronavirus 2 and its origin and evolution, I would like to talk a little bit about its close relative viruses, SARS coronavirus 1 and also the MERS coronavirus. The SARS coronavirus 1 caused the 2002 SARS epidemic in China. Around 8,000 cases were reported in 26 countries, and the mortality rate was close to 10%. So following this initial outbreak, China has launched a huge animal virus surveillance program. Then they found the SARS coronavirus-like viruses in Chinese horseshoe bats in wild, and also in the palm civets in the wet markets. So based on this evidence, it was concluded that this SARS coronavirus 1 jumped to human from bats through the civets as the intermediate host. Similarly, the MERS coronavirus, which caused the MERS epidemic in 2012 in Saudi Arabia, around 2,500 cases were reported in 27 countries. The mortality rate was close to 35%. So later we found that coronaviruses close to MERS coronavirus was found in bats in Saudi Arabia, few miles away from where the first case was reported. Later, we also found MERS like coronaviruses in camels in Asia, Africa, and Middle Eastern countries. So this suggested that MERS coronavirus jumped to human from bats through camel as intermediate host. So coming to the SARS coronavirus 2, which is causing the pandemic COVID-19, I would like to highlight what we know so far. So far, we know that this particular coronavirus is not very close to the MERS coronavirus or SARS coronavirus 1. Instead, we know that it is 96% identical to a bat coronavirus, RATG13, at the whole genome level. And also, we know that it is also 91% identical to a bunch of pangolin coronavirus. So it is believed that SARS coronavirus 2 jumped to human from bats through pangolin as an intermediate host. So evolutionarily, if you look at all the coronaviruses, there are 4 distinct groups: alpha coronaviruses, beta coronaviruses, gamma coronaviruses, and delta coronaviruses. Alpha and beta coronaviruses infect mostly mammals. Gamma coronaviruses infect fish, and the delta coronaviruses infect birds. If you look at the SARS coronavirus 1 and 2, and also the MERS coronavirus, they all belong to beta coronaviruses. To understand the evolution of this SARS coronavirus 2, we can build a phylogenetic tree as shown in the right side. It shows the evolutionary relationship between the viruses. The branching pattern in this tree shows how the virus evolves through a series of common ancestors. So this tree was built using the whole genome of several alpha and beta coronaviruses from human, animals, and bats. And you can see the group highlighted here, SARS coronavirus 2 group. In this group, the viruses labeled in pink in color, they are coronaviruses, SARS coronavirus 2 isolated from Wuhan. And you can see the closest ancestor is the bat coronavirus RATG13, which has 96% identity at the genome level. And these two groups are also very closely related to the pangolin coronavirus, which is highlighted in the red. So we can see this is closely, the SARS coronavirus 2 is very closely related to bat coronavirus, this particular bat coronavirus, and also the pangolin coronavirus. If you look at the SARS coronavirus 1, which is far up in the tree, which is not very closely related to the SARS coronavirus 2. So based on the similarity of the whole genome, we can come to this conclusion: pangolin coronaviruses probably jump to bat species. Then from the bat, it got transmitted to human and evolved as a SARS coronavirus 2. But it's not always that simple. If the another factor to be considered is the similarity at the spike protein level. As I mentioned earlier, spike protein determines the viral entry into the host cell, meaning the spike protein decides whether that particular virus can enter in the human cells or not. So if you look at the virus based on the spike protein similarity, the pangolin and the human coronaviruses, pangolin coronavirus and the human SARS coronavirus 2, they are very identical. The 5 key amino acids which determines the virus entry into the host cell, they are very, very identical between the pangolin coronavirus and the human coronavirus, SARS coronavirus 2. So based on this similarity, we can come to a conclusion that pangolin coronavirus directly came to the human, and then from human, maybe it spread to bat. So what it seems clearly to me is the SARS coronavirus 2 is a recombinant of maybe both pangolin and bat coronaviruses. The big question is whether this recombination has occurred naturally in the wild, or is it something like a man-made in the laboratory? There's a possibility for the man-made in the laboratory, because in Wuhan, there is a Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is one of the largest premier institute. They work on this human coronavirus and bat coronavirus for the last 15, 20 years. This is a speculation, but we don't have the evidence for that so far. So this is about the virus evolution in the animal and jumping from animal to human. Now a little bit talk about the ongoing evolution after the virus got into the human population, how it is evolving. So when the virus is infecting the human beings, it has to enter into the cell, and while it is inside the cell, it releases this viral genome, and then it makes millions of copies of this one viral genome to make a lot of viral particles. So in this process of copying the viral genome, the virus can introduce a lot of mutations. So this can lead to evolution of new strains of viruses. Some may be more virulent, some may be less virulent, some may be non-virulent. So there is a kind of ongoing evolution right now when the virus is spreading in the human population. So what the evidence shows so far is there are 2 strains of SARS coronavirus have been reported based on the mutations occurred during the spread in the human. The one is the S type, which is contributing to 40% of all infections. It appears to be less severe, and it's also appear to be evolutionarily closer to the bat and pangolin coronaviruses. If you look at this phylogenetic tree, this is S type. Seems like it is very close to the bat coronavirus and then pangolin coronavirus. The other type, L type, which is contributing to 60% of all infections, it's more severe, it's more aggressive, and it seems like it is evolved from the S type in the evolution. So if you look at the viruses in the initial outbreak in Wuhan, only a small percentage, around 3.7%, is actually S type. Majority of them are L type. But later on in the outside Wuhan, when it starts spreading, the L type proportion got reduced and the S type increased. It's believed that because of the human intervention and selective pressure, the L type is getting reduced. Maybe because of the severe disease, people are taking interventions. But this S type may be very mild. It's causing asymptomatic disease. It appears to be spreading rapidly. And also, based on certain specific mutation. The previous study was a very small study based on the 103 virus genomes that was sequenced. But this another study, this was based on more than 3,500 genomes that's sequenced from the human beings. So here, based on these mutations, specific 3 mutations, we were able to divide the viruses into 3 clades, S, V, and G. As you can see, the S seems to be in the very early during the outbreak, And as of March 31st, you can see the G is the primarily the major virus strain circulating in the population, almost 40%. But we don't know what is the significance of this clades, because we don't know what is their contribution of these clades in terms of what is the difference in terms of the virulence and the severity of the disease they could cause. So still, we are in the early stage to understand what is the significance of this based on these three clades. So we know the bats are very important and they are involved, and they are very important when it comes to coronavirus outbreaks. So obviously our preventive measure should be focused on the bats, and the eating the bats and selling them in the live market still practiced in China, Indonesia, and many Asian countries, even in Africa. I think that should be stopped. And also the viruses that are circulating the bats, what they harbor must be studied and monitored through the ecological surveillance. And also we should avoid bats even in the vicinity of farm animals. So sometimes what happens, the bats contaminate the feed or water in the farm animals and then transmit the virus to farm animals. And from farm animals, the people who are handling the animals, they get infected. In the past, several outbreaks has happened through this approach. And also the deforestation and human encroachment of the forest should be stopped, because that's where the bats live. I think if destroy a lot of forest, and they may move too closer to human beings. And also the wild animal trade has to be stopped. If you look at the pangolin, for example, a lot of this hard scales on the pangolin, it's used in the Chinese traditional medicine. So it's traded for these kind of purposes, which has to be stopped. And finally, the human behavior in terms of improving the hand hygiene, social distancing, particularly when somebody is suffering from respiratory infections, and also avoiding any unnecessary animal contact. This all has to be considered while talking about preventing the future coronavirus related outbreaks. So finally, one of the most important thing is that we have to start respecting the species barrier. You have to understand that each species have its own viruses, and when the virus jumps across the different species, always the new species will not have any immunity against that virus, so they can spread very rapidly. They can potentially cause the pandemic infection. So if you don't respect the interspecies barrier, then probably we have to suffer from interhuman barrier in terms of quarantine and isolation and other things. All right, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Senthil Kumar Natesan. I would request Dr. Arati Sundararajan to start her presentation. While Aarti is doing that, please post your questions in the chat box. We would like to have good question answer session at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Professor Vora. So my talk today is divided into two parts. The first one is an overview of the key elements of immune response against SARS-CoV-2 infection. And the second part focuses on the current vaccine scenario against this virus. Yeah. So this figure here shows a typical immune response to a controlled acute respiratory virus infection. So the first immune response is from the activated innate immune cells, such as these macrophages, neutrophils, monocytes, and NK cells, which start producing cytokines and also chemokines, which attract more innate cells to the site of infection, and also these dendritic cells, which take up the virus and present antigens to the T cells, both CD4 T cells and the cytotoxic CD8 T cells in the regional lymph nodes. In addition, soluble antigens from the virus can enter the lymph nodes and stimulate the activation and differentiation of B cells with help from the CD4 T cells to produce the antibodies. So this whole thing kind of kickstarts the late adaptive immune response, and the adaptive immune cells specific to the virus enter the site of infection in response to the chemokines, and together with this innate immune response, clear the virus. So you also have this long-term memory response generated that helps in case of reinfection, as the secondary response is rapid and greater in magnitude compared to the first one. So, but in this other scenario with uncontrolled infection, which often happens with chronic virus infection, there is a persistent innate activation. It does not go away and just lingers around. And there is a pro-inflammatory cytokine overload leading to T cell exhaustion and lymphopenia, meaning depletion of lymphocytes. So there is a situation of immunosuppression, and the virus is not cleared due to lack of strong adaptive immune response. So these two patterns of immune response in the combinatorial shape is what we see with moderate or mild versus a severe SARS-CoV-2 infection. So this slide here shows the innate immune response to SARS-CoV-2. So what's happening is in moderate type of infection, the pro-inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, they are produced, and we also have a slight decrease in lymphocytes. And in addition, there are mild clinical symptoms typical of cold, fever, cough, fatigue. So you have a controlled infection and virus is cleared and people recover. In contrast, in severe cases, there is what you call a cytokine storm, an overload of neutrophil associated products which can cause acute lung injury, and also pro-inflammatory cytokines, particularly IL-6, which is directly involved in liver damage, vascular leaks in blood vessels. So along with this cytokine imbalance, drastic depletion of lymphocytes is observed compared to a moderate infection. But again, not all cytokines are upregulated. So you have interferons, which are antiviral cytokines, and their production seems to be suppressed in SARS-CoV-2 infected patients, at least in the peripheral blood situation shown here in this graph here. So again, their expression in lungs, which is the site of primary infection, needs to be thoroughly evaluated. And interestingly, this feature is seen with other coronavirus infections, such as SARS-CoV, a delayed interferon response, severe disease. Sorry, there is some kind of a background going on. I think somebody has to mute,
Dr. Sandeep Shah, could you please unmute? Could you please mute your mic? Your mic is on, Dr. Shah.
Yeah, I think it's better now. Yeah. So as I was saying, there is some kind of a suppression of interferon response in SARS-CoV-2 infection. And interestingly, this feature is also seen with other coronavirus infections, such as the SARS-CoV, which causes SARS disease, where there is a delayed interferon response leading to a severe type of SARS disease. Now, in animal models, experimental administration of this type 1 interferon early on post-SARS infection actually resulted in a much milder disease with reduced virus load. So interferons could play an important role in SARS-CoV-2 pathogenesis, and it needs more further examination. Now, as I mentioned earlier, SARS-CoV-2 infection induces lymphopenia or depletion of lymphocytes. Now, one can use this feature in a clinical setting as a way to predict the progress of infection. So as shown here in figure A, This SARS-CoV-2 infected patients who died, so we are looking at the blue circles here, they have severe lymphopenia with percentage of lymphocytes in the blood dropping to less than 5% compared to patients with moderate infection, shown with orange circles here. So they had greater than 20% of lymphocytes in the peripheral blood. So this measurement could actually be done at 2 time points, one at 10 to 12 days post-infection, the other one at 17 to 19 days post-infection, for determining whether the patient can be curable or are they entering the ICU situation. So we have this reduction in T cells and B cells. So let's take a closer look at what is the B cell response to this virus. So as you all know, B cells produce virus-specific antibodies. And this figure here shows the kinetics of this response following SARS-CoV-2 infection. So right around the onset of clinical symptoms, you can start seeing this virus-specific IgM production. So now IgM is the first isotype of antibody produced, followed by class switch IgG antibodies, which come into circulation at around 14 days post-infection. IgM is out of the system, but IgG antibodies stick around for a long time. So in support of the antibody kinetics, the flow cytometry data shown here shows similar increase in plasma cells post-infection. So these are the cells that actually secrete the IgM and IgG antibodies. And in humans, you can identify them as CD27, CD38 double positives, as shown here inside that boundary there. So in order to effectively control infection, it is preferred that these antibodies are neutralizing type. So they bind to the surface of the virus, shown here, for example, to the spike protein, therefore blocking the binding of this virus to ACE2 receptor on the host cell, preventing the entering and infection of the host cell. And this is crucial because we want these type of antibodies to be generated in response to vaccination, for instance. And this is the underlying reason for performing convalescent plasma therapy, where plasma of recovered patient rich with these antibodies is transferred to another infected patient, mostly the severe ones, so the infected patient can get better quickly. So, and a few days back, ICMR also initiated a multi-center clinical trial to assess the safety and efficacy of this approach. So the other component of the B cell response to infection is the B cell memory compartment, which provide the long-term protection. So in response to reinfection, memory B cells differentiate into plasma cells and secrete the virus-specific antibodies. So in case of SARS infection, what has been seen is that both the circulating antibodies, as shown here, and the memory B cells are hardly detectable after 6 years of infection. So this is a major issue with respect to protection in case we are thinking of reinfection issues in the long term. With respect to SARS-CoV-2 infection, we will have to wait and see down the lane what happens to B cell memory and long-term antibodies. But this points to a need to strengthen this component in our vaccination strategies against this virus. Now let's take a quick look at what happens to T cells in SARS-CoV-2 infection. So I had mentioned earlier there is reduction in T cell numbers, but functionally these cells are exhausted with increasing severity of infection. So more work needs to be done, but these cells demonstrate basically a progressive loss of usual functions, that is ability to produce cytokines, loss of proliferative capacity, cytotoxic potential, which eventually leads to their deletion or depletion. They also continuously express inhibitory receptors. Now, in other chronic diseases, exhausted T cells continue to be exhausted even after repeated antigen exposure. So there are other type of T cells called as regulatory T cells. Now, these are critical regulators of inflammation, and that is very relevant to the cytokine storm that we see in severe SARS infection. But what is sad is that even Tregs are severely depleted in severe infection cases. So overall, this completes an overview of immune response against SARS-CoV-2 infection in mild or moderate situation versus severe cases. And this research is expanding every day. So clear understanding of immune response following live virus infection is essential for designing effective vaccination strategy against this virus. So let's take a quick look at what COVID-19 clinical vaccine trials are ongoing in the world today. But before that, I'll give a quick overview of a typical vaccine development process. First, you have a preclinical stage where candidate virus associated targets are identified and validated through in vitro experiments and in animal models, such as mice or ferrets or non-human primates. You also assess protection post virus challenge. So if this stage is successful, then you move on to humans with phase 1, 2, 3, 4. All phases, you're constantly testing for safety because that is critical. And the number of participants also increase as the trial progresses. Around phase 2 stage, you also try to see what dosage could be given, is booster dose required, and those sort of questions there. So the final phase involves the target population, assessing the vaccine efficacy in the target. For example, in SARS-CoV-2, you're looking at elderly population and those with comorbidities, for example. So in parallel, vaccine has to be scaled up and so that distribution goals can be met, and then approval from regulatory authorities have to be taken. So you see the whole process is really very, very long. But we do have some lessons that we can learn from vaccine platforms that have been developed for other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS. This is a little busy slide, but I just want to make a few points. First, vaccines against these coronaviruses are still in clinical trials, as you see here. Some are also in preclinical stages. Secondly, in the preclinical stage, what is happening is post-vaccination animals and challenge with the live virus, there is protection. So you're looking at the right side table here. There is protection, which is great news. But there is also significant immunopathology in lungs. So this provides concern for trials with SARS-CoV vaccines in humans. Clinical trials with SARS coronavirus vaccines have been conducted and reported to induce antibody responses and to be safe. However, the evidence for safety is for a short time, and it is unclear if similar immunopathologic reaction could occur among vaccinated individuals on exposure to infectious SARS-CoV-2. And additional concerns also relate to effectiveness and safety of vaccines against these subtle antigenic variants of SARS-CoV-2 that are emerging. For example, I would just like to point out this D614G mutation in the spike protein involving the conversion of the amino acid aspartate to glycine at this particular 614 position of the spike protein. So preliminary studies show, as shown here, that pre-March situation was G614 domination, shown by this orange box. And then gradually the mutation shown by this blue box, the G614, is taking over. So as most vaccines being developed currently target the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2, we really need to be keeping track of these mutations as we go on this journey. So currently we have at least 8 candidate vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 in clinical evaluation stage. So you can see these traditional vaccine platforms like inactivated virus vaccine and also the non-replicating viral vectors such as the adenovirus type of vector which carry the spike sequence. We also have some interesting modern vaccine platforms like the DNA vaccine from Inovio, right at the bottom of this table here, where the DNA plasmid is carrying the spike sequence, and it uses this handheld proprietary device called Selectra, shown here in the picture on the corner. So that is used for electroporating the cells post intradermal vaccine delivery, so that the DNA can easily be taken into the cells. So the idea is that the DNA is transcribed into mRNA, which is translated to spike protein and then triggers the immune response, providing immunity. Moderna and BioNTech, along with Pfizer, they are using the RNA platform. So it's similar, but here you have the mRNA coding for spike protein is injected as a vaccine that is encapsulated in lipid nanoparticles. And again, mRNA transcription to spike protein in cells, and that triggers the immune response. But these new platforms have never been tested before, and they have not been licensed so far. So we will need to wait and see what comes out of them. We also have biotech and pharma companies in India developing vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. I've just listed a few of them here. They're all in preclinical stage. At least 100 candidate vaccines are in this stage throughout the world. So we have in India Zydus Cadila, Indian Immunologicals, and Bharat Biotech. And they're also developing some interesting platforms such as live attenuated vaccines. So that's where the virulence of the virus is attenuated or reduced through site-directed mutations and replicating virus vectors which trigger all aspects of the immune response efficiently. So lastly, I would like to touch a little bit on the concept of herd immunity that everybody is talking about these days in the context of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So as shown in this figure, an infected person, that's the red circle there, will be easily be able to transmit the virus to susceptible people, shown in black circles. So once the infected people recover, which is shown in the green circles here, they act as a wall between the infected person and susceptible people. So the virus transmission stops with them due to prior immunity. So susceptible people are indirectly protected. So with time, you reach this situation of herd immunity. So same herd immunity could be achieved in the context of vaccination also. However, there are several challenges to practically employing herd immunity. It's not easy. So it's still unclear whether any prior infection can offer protection against future ones. In addition, if you look at this graph here, large numbers of people have to be infected, and in the process, casualties and fatalities will be too high. So you should also have excellent healthcare system to take care of increased number of infected people. India has a relatively large young population, but what is also to be noted is comorbidity and risk factors typically associated with severe COVID-19 disease are also high in this age group. And isolation of older Indians is difficult because everyone lives with their children and grandchildren mostly in a joint family setting. So it will be important to support with increased health system capacity and also ramped up testing. So with that, thank you for listening, and everybody stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Aarti, for excellent presentation. I would request Dr. Sandeep Shah to make the presentation. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. It was a really very nice presentation. I think everyone can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's right. So it was a very nice presentation from Aarti and quite a deep dive for all the vaccine present program and other things. So I'm going to represent at this moment only about that what are the testing facility and what are the different test type of the test available in the market or in India or other places and how they are better or which one is good or bad that we just like to discuss it about that part. So as everyone is aware about this structure, I think more or less everywhere, so many presentation, the structure is there. But I would like to just go into detail of the three things that the presence of the nuclear, whatever the virus is there, that is the RNA chain is there, and it will be covered by the nucleocapsid, which is a highly, you can say, the glycoprotein in nature. Membrane glycoprotein is there, then the spike protein is there, envelope protein is there, and RNA is there. So these are the main five structure which we will like to identify by the different method, either by the PCR or antibody based test or whatever the test we will get it. We'll try to find out they are specific for this COVID-19 virus, and we will look at it by the different methodology that which one we are able to identify faster in a proper method, how fast is we can do it. So when we talk about the molecular testing, there are five different type of the genes what we discussed as the N gene, means that's the nucleocapsid, spike protein, envelope protein, E gene, then the RNA dependent RNA polymerase, and the ORF1. So RNA dependent RNA polymerase is a less sensitive because of the reverse primer mismatch. When they identify the mismatch is there sometime, and that's the reason many of the kit will give the less sensitivity on when they use the RDRP, but it is very specific also. So whenever we talk about that real-time PCR or the reverse transcriptase real-time PCR, we will try to identify different area of the gene. As I told you, what we have decided, I have described in the previous slide, saying that RDRP or the N gene or the E gene, we will always try to look at it by the different methodology. The test procedure details about the real-time PCR is the first, whatever the sample we will get it, either nasopharyngeal swab or nasal swab, sputum, bronchoalveolar lavage, sometimes the stool also possible, or any different type of the fluid, we will first isolate the RNA from that particular sample. So that is a separate procedure. The sample has to be extracted, RNA has to be extracted from that particular sample. And afterwards, we will add the probe and primers in that particular sample, and we will go for the real-time PCR machine. See, the probe and primers is what? The probe and primers means there is a specific chain against whatever the gene you want to examine, which is a very specific for that particular virus. We will add it, and we will also add the other pre-adenine, guanine, tyrosine, and cytosine, which will also use to extend that chain. So whatever the chain we will add it, whatever the probes we will add it, there is a specific fluorescent dye is attached to it. So when we have a multiplex PCR, means we identify straight away 4 different type of the gene in the same sample, and they 4 are attached with a different color dye, a fluorescent dye with that all the probes. With the different temperature with the Taq polymerase enzyme, what will happen in the PCR machine, it will increase the temperature and decrease the temperature very fast. So at different temperature, Taq polymerase, with the help of Taq polymerase enzyme and the probe and primers, it will attach, if at all the sample has that particular chain, it will attach to it, it will join to each other. Again, at the high temperature, it will be again, it will use as that separated. So there's multiple cycles continuously, nearly 45 cycles we use it for this reaction. That from small one chain, it will be multiplied very fast. And after the multiplication, during any joining together, there is a fluorescent dye will be also depolarized, and it will extract the color. That color will be measured by the machine. So that's the reason it is known as a real-time PCR, because whatever the PCR reaction is on, we will identify in a real time that okay, the reaction is on and the cycle is going on. And that's the way we identify that particular sample is having a positive sample, the sample is positive or negative. The third thing is very important, whatever which should be present in the graphical format. As I told you, the blue colored dye, which shows the sample is there, which shows the positivity for specific gene. So cycles means continuous up and down of the temperature, and cycle threshold. We always find out the cycle threshold up to what cycle we will say it is a negative. So we, in this particular case, up to 40 cycles, if there is no expression of the dye or there is no color we machine can measure, we consider it is a negative. But if the sample is having a very high amount of the RNA, then definitely this color upgrade, expression of the color or the color depolarization of the color will be at the very early cycle. So cycle threshold, if it is at the 20 cycle, it shows that there is a very high level of the or a high amount of the RNA. So if you will get the cycle threshold at the 20 cycles, it means that it suggests that a very high viral load. And if the CT value is high, means that we are getting a color or whatever the fluorescent dye will be injected at the 40 cycles or 38 cycle, it shows that that particular sample is having a low viral load. So now the sensitivity for the different specimen. See, this methodology, what we do it, because we usually, everyone is using nearly multiplex PCR, where they are using the E gene, N gene, and RDRP altogether. So sensitivity of this methodology is very high. But because of the specimen, what specimen we are using it, according to the specimen, we will get the different sensitivity. The best specimen is the bronchoalveolar lavage, but it is an invasive procedure. No one would like to do it for all the patients, but it has a sensitivity of the 93%. The reason is that it will present directly all the viruses from the lung itself, sputum. But usually in this particular infection, there is a dry cough. Sputum cannot be produced from the lung so many times. But if at all the sputum is produced and patient will give the sputum, the sensitivity goes up to 72%. What we measure most of the time is the nasal swab. And nasal swab is having a sensitivity of the 63%. Or we combine the nasopharyngeal swab. All together, combination of the pharyngeal swab and the nasal swab, we will get the sensitivity of the 67%. So that is the way the sensitivity. In this stool also, we also accept the stool specimen also, because in the small babies, many a times we are not able to collect the nasopharyngeal swab also. So when the stool specimen is able, the sensitivity goes up to 57%. So this is the sensitivity of the different specimen, what we get it. But the specificity of the real-time PCR is 100%. When it says that it is a positive, it is positive. Negativity or the sensitivity, that depends on the specimen, the collection method, and the time of the collection. Collection method means if you have not really taken a proper swab, you may get false negative. It's a basically inadequacy of the, or you can say in the laboratory terminology, pre-analytical error. Analytical error, if at all someone, there is a reagent is not up to the mark, or there is a contamination, RNA contamination from the atmosphere in this particular area, then you will get the false positive sample. Otherwise, the false negativity are very less. So another test, these are the real-time PCR. We will discuss when and how to go for the test at the end. Just now, I'm just trying to look at all the different type of the test availability. The presence of the antibody in the, or the formation of the antibody in the human body. We can use the serum samples because all the serum contains the antibody, and retrospectively also we can use it if at all we preserve those samples. We can also validate the serology test because whenever it is available. Nowadays, there are a lot of different methodologies available. There is a rapid immunochromatographic method. I think the most of the companies are using at this moment because we can go in the field and we can carry out the test. But rapid test, I don't say, according to my experience most of the time, rapid test, the sensitivity is somewhat less. We may use the ELISA, CLIA method or CMIA method. CLIA method is available with the DiaSorin instrument, that's the automated platform. ELISA also available on the automated or microbial ELISA, and CMIA is a Abbott. So these four, and not many Roche and other company also have come with the CLIA method or ECLIA method, where the sensitivity is become high. The reason is that it's a controlled environment, controlled antibodies, and the controlled reactions. Different type of the kit measures a different type of the antibody. Either they measure IgG alone or IgG plus IgM, known as a total antibody. In rapid, there is IgG plus IgM or IgG alone is also available. So which type of the antibody we supposed to use, or which one is better? As I told you, the nuclear capsid, which is basically a protein with the carbohydrate, which is a strongly antigenic. And antigen very sensitive and specific compared to other antigen. But however, the receptor binding domain of the S protein or the spike protein, which is a very important one, should measure it because in host, as Dr. Arti has described, that in the host there's an ACE receptor, and this spike protein attached with the ACE receptor and give all the symptoms. If we measure the S protein, which is a host attachment protein and antibody RBD protein, would be more specific and also which will expected to neutralize the S protein. So the symptoms, if at all patient has developed this RBDS type of the protein or as an antibody, then definitely the symptoms in the patient will be much lesser, or maybe the immunity is more. And therefore, using one or more antigen for detecting IgG and IgM antibody results in a high sensitivity. So we prefer that the kit which are available should also cover the nuclear capsid antigen or antibody against that should measure, and also the RBDS protein also should be there. How it will appear? The IgM antibody will appear as early as 4th day if there is a severe infection after the symptom onset, and higher level occurs in 2nd and 3rd week of the illness. IgM persists up to 3 weeks after the symptoms, whereas the IgG will persist beyond the 7 weeks also. So we should measure IgG and IgM together for the diagnosis. See, now the combined sensitivity for the PCR and the ELISA, like combined sensitivity of the PCR and ELISA directed as nucleocapsid IgM is 98.6% versus 51.9% with only single PCR test. Because we do not know when the patient has been infected. During the first 5.5 days, PCR has a higher sensitivity than IgM, whereas the IgM ELISA has a higher positivity rate after the 5.5 days of illness. High titer of the IgG antibodies detected by ELISA shown positivity correlates with the active neutralizing antibody if we have used RBDS or the receptor binding protein and S protein. The long-term persistence and the duration of the protection conferred by the neutralizing antibody still remains unknown. As Dr. Arti told about, there is a lot of mutation is there in the S spike protein. So up to what time this neutralizing antibody will not allow the virus to grow. This is a very important one, how and when to appear. So there's a first blue line, if you look at it, is the nasopharyngeal swab, which has been submitted for the PCR. When the SARS-CoV-2 infection, patient has got the infection and still patient is asymptomatic, many a times you will not get a positive reaction against it. So after when the symptom is there and if you carry out the test, then there are fair chances in the nasopharyngeal swab that you will get a positive reaction. Virus isolation from the respiratory tract also remains same. If the patient is having a symptoms, we will get a better results for that. We have used the bronchoalveolar lavage also, which will also give the very early positivity, and stool PCR, which will be positive after the 1st week or the 7th or 8th day of the infection. And it may remain very long time that the virus may be excreted in the stool for a long time. See, now the question is that the PCR reaction is positive means that the patient is positive for the infection, because the dead virus also give the positivity. The symptoms, association with the symptoms may not be appear, like after 14th day, you may get a positive PCR reaction, but patient may not have any live virus. Patient may not have any infectivity. So the positivity in the PCR many times is questionable. If we are continuing the test, patient may have positive reaction up to 3 to 4 weeks also for the PCR. When we talk about the antibody, as I told you, IgM antibody and IgG antibody, IgM antibody will appear most of the time after 7 days, and IgG also appears same time after 7 days of the infection. As I told you, in the severe infection, IgM antibody may appear in the body on the 4th or 5th day of the infection. IgG remains beyond the 7 week, but usually IgM will become negative on 4th or 5th week of the infection. So this is a graphical presentation of the, so one can use it, how to diagnose PCR, how to diagnose, how to use both methods together to get it. Like the question is that when we talk about the pre-operative, when we are not aware that patient will be really infective or not to the doctor. So at that time, according to the guideline, one should use the PCR and IgM antibodies together. If both are negative, suggests that patient is negative. If IgG is positive, then it means that the patient is immune. So that's the way one should use both the tests together, not only one test when we are talking about. In this particular area, when there is an active or pandemic is on and active disease are there, at that time the PCR has a more value. It is a gold standard. Rapid has given a lot of different type of the reaction and it has been withdrawn. But now from 20th May, Diazorin, all this IgG or total antibodies of the ROS will enter in the market and it will be available afterwards. No doubt the guideline will be given by the ICMR that we can use it or not at this moment. That guideline will be given by the ICMR. We can start those using those tests or not. So conclusion that whatever the data has been published, they are mainly from the adult population for the specifically IgG and IgM type of antibody who are not immunocompromised. The time course of the PCR positivity and the seroconversion may vary in children and other groups, including the large population of the asymptomatic individuals who go on undiagnosed without active surveillance. Many questions still remain how long the immunity lasts in individuals, both symptomatic and asymptomatic. So these are the questions still pending who someone has to answer it, and with the more and more experience, we will be able to answer those questions. And thanks a lot for.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Thank you, all the speakers. Those were excellent presentations. We have received some questions. One question that is there is about pets and animal husbandry. I think Dr. Senthil Kumar can answer to that question, that how is this pandemic related to pet animals and animal husbandry?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we have some evidence virus has been detected in South Korea in cats and also in few canines. So, but I think how whether they can transmit to people or that we don't have the evidence. But there is some evidence that cats and dogs can be infected. But again, this is all based on we need more data in terms of or how their ACE2 receptor in their cells. If any animal has a ACE2 receptor similar to human beings, they are potentially can be infected. They can acquire the virus. They allow the virus to enter inside the cells, and they can potentially get infected.
I think the question is that can pets transfer the infection, because that has been a very big debate recently, that if you are handling animals, if you have pets, would that be high risk?
Yes, there is a risk, but we don't have enough data to confidently say that yes, there is no, as far as I know, there are no cases reported that has been transmitted from a dog to a human being. But we know that some of the dogs or cats were positive, but from them whether human acquired any disease, that we don't know.
Okay, this question, yes, thank you. This question could be taken by Dr. Shah or Aarti. There are 2-3 questions about reinfection or relapse, why it occurs, what can be done to prevent it, and how do you diagnose or how do you make sure that it doesn't happen?
I can just add in a few points to that question. So I think what even recently WHO released a statement regarding this, that those which are termed as reinfection, possibly you're detecting dead virus, the cells that are the dead virus basically. So you maybe be detecting some of this false positive reaction. So we are not yet very clear on this scenario of reinfection. That's my take on it. Yeah.
Dr. Shah?
The reinfection is basically, see, on the 14th or 15th day after getting a 2 negative sample also, we'll get a third positive sample. So is it because of the reactive infection or the reinfection, or there are chances we are identifying the dead virus? No one knows about it. But because of the people are thinking that because this S protein mutating so fast, the mutant, there are chances that reinfection can occur because those antibody body has produced may not work, and there are chances may have a reinfection.
A related question, Dr. Shah, was that why is this virus mutating so fast? Maybe Dr. Senthil Kumar can also add, and so you can answer the question.
I think Dr. Senthil Kumar can take over.
Yeah, let me take it. So generally, the RNA virus tend to have more mutations. Generally, when the RNA virus replicates, and the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, they'll generally lack a proofreading activity. So when they copy their parental RNA while making the progeny viruses, they introduce a lot of mutations. But in fact, actually, this particular SARS coronavirus 2, they do have a proofreading activity compared to other RNA viruses. They are less prone to introduce mutations. But if you look at the number of cells get infected in the lung and other parts of the body, and I think in one cycle we have data that while the whole 30,000 base pair is added while synthesizing the new viral genome, it can introduce around 3 to 5 mutations. And so that's how, so eventually it will accumulate a lot of mutations. But the most important thing is that the significance of those mutations, whether those mutations contribute to any amino acid change, as Aarti mentioned. If that's contributing any amino acid change, that too particularly in the spike protein, that too in the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, then that's going to significantly change the nature of the virus.
On the
Thank you,
lighter
Dr.
side,
Senthil.
because it is made in China, it mutates very fast. They're used to many new products taking out. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Dr. Shah, a question for you. There has been a lot of debate about testing and lack of testing or how it should be done. So we would like to have your take on the current situation in India, if you know about elsewhere, and what is your opinion about how it should be done?
So if you want to stop spread of the disease, then testing is must. As much test you can do it, you can quarantine those many people and you can stop spread of the disease. For the infection activities, the question is that how many tests one should do it? Like as the WHO has already announced that you just test, and test. And that will cycle or the chain will be, you can break it very fast. If you test more, if you find more and more people, asymptomatic or symptomatic, who are transmitting the disease, quarantine, and you get a more and more results for that. So according to the test, number of the tests as world is doing and they are able to do it, that is the best idea to do it. What we have done it in the early phase, we have not tested enough people. And that is the time we have really missed it. If you would have tested more and more people on those days, then chances in Ahmedabad, what is going on has been, it is going to happen, but can reduce it.
And as you said, do you think apart from PCR, having some other modality would help?
Yeah, definitely. When we are talking, see, the first thing is that we want to identify the spreaders. And second thing, we want to identify a disease person. When we talk about the disease or patient is having an active infection with the symptoms, then as I told you, the PCR plus IgM antibody together will give the best result. We will not miss the diagnosis. The diagnosis and the second thing is that spreaders. So there are two different things. So according to me, when we talk about the preoperative workup or we want to talk about that patient is having a symptoms and still we will get lot many patients now because the sensitivity of the nasopharyngeal swab, as I told you, is only 67-70%. So at that time, the mixture of both the thing will give a better result.
And there's one question about how long the virus lasts in the open air. I don't know who wants to take this.
See, according to me, I can just tell you, we may get the sample from the different places all over India because we are working with the Madhya Pradesh government also, and we get the sample on the third and fourth day. I don't know how much we have lost, but still we are able to give lot many positives out of that. So it shows that they are surviving. Uh, I think the Dr. Senthil Kumar or the researchers can give a better idea what are the survival of this virus. But the RNA can survive for a long time if it has been transported in the VTM, viral transport media.
Yeah, I think so. Really, the two things. Yeah, one is if you are talking about live virus, that's having a potential to infect. If you talk about that, yeah, there are a couple of factors clearly play a role. One is the temperature, and another one is the humidity. And there are some studies done in U.S. Military shows that if you increase the temperature and humidity significantly, it neutralizes the infectivity, so makes the virus become non-infective. But still, those samples can be used for viral genome detection by RT-PCR. So yeah, if you're talking about the infectivity, the infectious virus hanging around in the surfaces on the air, yeah, then we have to uh, it's not very long. If you look at it, I think around maximum 24 hours in the environment they can survive. That too, if it is like a copper surface, it's much lower, and maybe less than 8 hours. But if it is a cardboard or if it is a stainless steel surface, it may be around 8 to 24 hours. So it's a critical thing is this is RNA virus and this is enveloped virus. So the lipid layer is more prone to damage, and by any temperature or in a simple chemical, if it damages, it really removes that spike proteins. So those viruses become non-infectious. Still, that can be, still the capsid will be having the RNA. The samples can be used for detection. As Dr. Sandeep said, the samples can have the RNA, but the infectivity may be lost.
I have one question, Dr. Senthil, that at what temperature this cell wall or the nuclear capsid, because we are using, we extract the RNA by the different method. There is another method which is very well known for the RNA virus. If you will incubate it for 10 minutes for 95 degrees centigrade, the nuclear capsid will be removed and you can straight away, instead of going very lengthy procedure of the extraction, you can straight away go for the PCR reaction. So will it be like that or not? That's my question is there.
Yeah, that will make sense because basically the higher temperature, 95 degree, it breaks open your nucleocapsid and releases the single stranded genome freely into the fluid, so which can be used for converting into cDNA and detecting the PCR. So yeah, denaturation at higher temperature helps two things. One, nucleocapsid opening and releasing the genome. Another thing, it also destroys all the other proteins which can destroy the RNA, like RNases and other things. So if you more heat denature the sample, the RNA in the sample will be also more stable. That will help in the detection.
Specific to this session, these were the questions. There are other questions about how hospital administration can fight against COVID-19 and all. We are going to have webinars on those on future dates. Please keep watching our Facebook page. If anyone has any other question which is related to this webinar, please unmute your mic and you can ask, because I don't see any on chat anymore.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I'm Richard here from MPH students, sir. Sir, actually, my question is, they have been found Chimpack adenovirus has been so useful in monkeys. So these monkeys have been closer primates for the human species. So whether these vaccines can be used for human species. And another question is whether LAMP assay, when compared to the LAMP assay and real-time PCR, in terms of sensitivity, which is very best, sir?
I'll take the first question. Yeah, I think there was some connectivity issue, I think. So you were saying your question was like a adenovirus, Chimpack
Chimpack adenovirus, sir.
So can you repeat that question again? So what was the question?
Sir, there's the Chimpack adenovirus has been discovered, no, sir, in the 6 monkeys. So the monkeys have been playing like a closer primates to our human species. Whether this Chimpack adenovirus can be used in human species, sir?
See, there are a lot of adenoviruses have been, isolated and used as a viral vector for making vaccines against different diseases. So already there are several very well-known adenoviruses, but this Chimpack adenovirus, I'm not aware of it. But so what you're saying is whether it can be used for, in the human for making the vaccines or introducing a new antigen, right?
Yes,
so yeah,
sir. Yes,
a
sir.
lot of adenoviruses are there, such adenoviruses. Even for HIV vaccines, they use the adenoviral vector.
Senthil, if I may just point out, so the one that Richard is talking about is the vaccine model that the people in University of Oxford are developing currently.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
That's the Chimpack adenovirus vector. So basically, they have changed this vector a little bit, so it becomes a non-replicating type. So it just offers a vehicle, but it's not going to affect, cause any disease in humans and or in primates for that matter, because they have modified it into a non-replicating vehicle. So that's just carrying a spike sequence in it, and that's the form of the vaccine. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the second question is, when compared to the LAMP assay in terms of sensitivity and cost effective, whether LAMP assay is better than real-time PCR?
I think
Sandeep bhai, do you want to, Sandeep bhai, Sandeep bhai, you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Sandeep bhai is there? Sandeep bhai?
Maybe I'll take that question. Yeah. So it is if it depends on the design of the assay. There are for several organisms we know that LAMP assay is more sensitive, but I think again the primers that goes into that assay design, the sensitivity of the primer, where they bind, if there is any variation in that region, then that assay may not be sensitive. So I think it's lot. If you look at the design properly, I think the LAMP will be much more sensitive because it can pick up even few copies of the RNA.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Any other burning questions?
Good morning, sir. I have actually 3 questions. The first one is that Israel just came up with a claim that it has developed a monoclonal antibody to treat this virus. So I want you to throw some light on that. How does that work, or what is the future of that cure, and how fast will it be able to recover patients? The second is the drug which is developed by Gilead Pharmacy, which is known as Remdesivir. So, what is the mode of effect of the mode of this drug, and how does it act on the virus, and how effective it would be? And the third one is that can corticosteroids be used for the treatment or at some phase of the treatment to, for example, to control the cytokine storm or something? Or would it be
Well,
more disastrous in using corticosteroids or some immunosuppressive drugs?
So,
so will ask,
yeah.
let me answer your first two probably. The monoclonal antibody, yeah, it's the monoclonal antibodies are now recognized very well recognized as drugs. If you look at in the cancer treatment, there are several MABs that's already approved and used in the cancer treatment. So yeah, for treating the COVID-19, yeah, MAB is a potential drug, and but I think yeah, we have to see where it is binding. If that MAB is binding in the spike protein, particularly on the receptor binding domain, if you can block the virus binding to the cell, then yeah, it's a potential. It's a great drug. But we have to we have to see the data on that. The second question on the remdesivir mode of action. So this particular drug is it's RNA dependent RNA polymerase inhibitor. So this is the enzyme the coronavirus uses to copy its genome when it is replicating inside the human cell. So this is a very specific drug that can inhibit the coronavirus replication. So it's a class of drug called a nucleoside analog. About the corticosteroids, yeah, I think the clinicians would be the best people to answer that. But to control the cytokine storm in other settings, in cancer settings, they use one drug which is IL-6 receptor blocker, which is very effective. So what happens in the cytokine storm is the IL-6 is highly produced. So that increases the body temperature, induce a lot of inflammation. So there's a mechanism to block that IL-6 receptor. It's shown extremely well in treating and managing the cytokine storm. I'm not sure about if you don't have any such drug, then I'm sure I think corticosteroid like immunosuppressive can be used, but I'm not sure on that.
Okay, and one more question, sir.
Aarti,
If the, as you are saying, that the drug mutates at a very fast rate, then will the MAB treatment still be effective against some of those, or will the treatment, like the MAB, completely go to waste or something?
Yeah, that is a possibility. Yeah. So you are looking at the monoclonal antibody that is binding to an epitope, which is 6 to 8 amino acids, right? If there is a one mutation in that MAB binding region, that MAB may not work. So yeah, there is a chance that in future, due to mutations on the virus, evolution of the mutations in the virus, that drug may become ineffective. Then there are like a companion diagnostics now. So in that case, the patient virus has to be tested for spike protein, whether it has that required mutation for the drug to work. So there are drugs available in the market like that. You can combine that with some diagnostics and then prescribe the drug only if that person has the virus which is susceptible to that drug.
Aarti, you
Great.
want to add
Thank you very
Yeah,
much, sir.
yeah. So just great points central there. I would just like to add the monoclonal antibody treatment. So the other drawback of that is I think it's very expensive and not very easy to mass produce them. So it may be great in the clinical setting in a small group, but in order to mass scale it, it's going to be expensive. And regarding this remdesivir, there was that study that was conducted, right, in US. So what basically the results came out was those with they had the group which received remdesivir, they had a mortality rate of around 8% versus the
Yes.
placebo group which had 11.6%. So it's not very great, but I think okay, it's doing a subtly good job of getting there. And regarding the cytokine storm, I would agree with all the points that Senthil made, but I would just add that it's early on is where you have to take all these corticosteroids or whatever, but it has to be balanced because we also want the immune response to clear the virus. So it's a subtle balance in terms of how you want to take it forward. So that would be my yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the questions. Because we are running out of time, I would request Professor Maulankar to say something about the institute and especially the master's program that we have and upcoming webinars.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Dr. Sandeep Shah of Supratech Newburgh Laboratory, Dr. Senthil Natesan, Professor at IIPH, and Dr. Aarti Sundararajan, who is also working with us as a Department of Science and Technology Women Scientist Program Fellow. I think they have given an excellent overview of a very complex sort of molecular biology level view of this virus, how it developed, how it spreads, what are the immunological issues and testing. So we were trying to see if this complex issue can be explained very lucidly to a sort of semi-scientific, because not all of you are doctors and microbiologists, so but they could explain it, I think, very well. With that, let me address some of the questions I was reading. We offer, as a public health university, we are a unique public health focused university, the only and the first public health university. We offer 2 years full-time master's program and 2-year full-time Master of Hospital Administration. So first is Master of Public Health, second different program is Master of Hospital Administration. Both are 2-year full-time, of which 18 months roughly is on campus and 6 months of dissertation or practical work in the hospital setting is there. The admissions are normally through your past record and a personal interview and group discussion and a test of English. But this year, given that possibility of personal interviews may be difficult, we may have to do it through Skype interview. So we have some modification of that possible this year. The last deadlines for application are end of May. We are also organizing a separate seminar about what is the scope of these subjects, because this public health and hospital management are new subjects for master's degree in India. So on 12th of May, we are organizing a separate seminar to talk about what is the scope of this program. And if people are interested, we will organize a future series of seminars to understand what can we contribute through public health to such epidemic control. And I'm very happy to also tell you that many of our alumni of last 3 years and the PG diploma program alumni who are government medical officers and private graduates who have done that are contributing actively as corona epidemic warriors in many government and non-governmental positions. So I think that is what I wanted to convey to you. Please keep watching our Facebook and other social media platforms so you will come to know how this and future seminars will be organized. We are also trying to get some international speakers from New York, from other places where major epidemics have happened, to see how they are managing and what is the epidemiology there and how it differs. And we will also try to get people from Delhi and Bombay, where also epidemic is in full force, to understand how do we develop our response to this. So with that, let me thank all of you who have taken out 1.5 hours of time out of the lockdown period where you are, and listen to this, very actively ask questions. I'm sure we have not answered all of the questions, but we have this recorded session. So hopefully we will also put it up on our website as well as our social media, those who could not attend. So please share with your friends or those who are interested in the subject when we put this out. So thank you very much. Kranti, back to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you in our future webinars also. Some of the questions would be answered in those too. So please keep watching our Facebook page and be safe and be happy. Thank you.